For a little background, when I was 15, I was put in a short-term psychiatric inpatient at the hospital in my town. It was because I tried to kill myself, followed by a small breakdown in partial inpatient, which is basically inpatient where you go home to sleep. After the breakdown and impartial, they put me in full inpatient. It was during this time that my diagnosis was switched from depression to bipolar, and I haven't been back to inpatient since. But I was definitely very unstable at the time, so this all really freaked me out. The way the bedrooms were laid out, there would be 2 bedrooms with separate entrances connected to a small foyer with an open doorway to the main hall. No one was allowed into your private bedroom space except yourself, and only the 2 people in the bedrooms connected to it were allowed in their foyer. For my 3 days, I had a really nice roommate named Amber. Amber and I would sit in our foyer and talk, mostly about things we were dealing with. On my 3rd day, Amber was sent home. I was bummed, because as a result, I had no one I could share my space with. I spent my 3rd night alone. On the evening of my 4th day, a new girl came to inpatient, named Jade. Being a girl, she was put in my room block, rather than the other empty space where her roommate would have been a guy. She was 14, a year younger than I was, and appeared to be Filipino in ethnicity. She had long dark hair that went halfway down her back and seemed very quiet. I was very polite to her, mainly since I was happy to not be alone in my block anymore. She didn't talk a whole lot for the first hour or so that she was there, but when we went to our block pre-bedtime, she explained to me why she was there. You see, the thing about her was that she seemed pretty normal up until she talked. The second she started talking, I felt immediately creeped out. It's not that what she was saying was all that weird, it's how she talked. There was an edge to her voice that wasn't quite right, and it made her seem almost unresponsive to what she was saying. Her mannerisms seemed ever so slightly forced. She went on to basically tell me that she and her friends had gotten really drunk, and while running around doing drunk people things, she got caught and put in inpatient. That didn't add up at all. You don't get put in inpatient for getting drunk with your friends, but a lot of people had bogus stories about how they'd gotten in, so I just shrugged it off. She was very quiet most of the following day. That evening, when TV time was about to start, Jade and I were sitting in the TV room with a 3rd girl from inpatient named Ruby. You see, Ruby and I actually ended up being friends in the outside world. After coincidentally seeing each other again over a year after inpatient, we ended up reminiscing about this incident with Jade, which Ruby also recalled. The 3 of us were alone in the room because the staff had walked out for a minute to talk to the desk person just outside of the room. She was within view, but more than likely couldn't really hear the conversation. Ruby, Jade, and I were all sitting on the couch. I was in the middle, with Ruby to my right and Jade to my left. Ruby and I were talking about our cats on the outside. We were both missing our pets. It was common for the teens in inpatient to talk about the things they love the most on the outside. Jade wasn't in the conversation, really, but suddenly piped up saying that she hated cats. She went on to tell a story about how a stray had once scratched her, so she killed it and chopped it up, then left pieces of it in the woods. If the story wasn't creepy enough on its own, recall how I described her demeanor. She said all this as though she could have been ordering a cup of coffee or talking about the weather. It was horrifying. Ruby and I exchanged a look, and one of us asked about whether that was the first time she killed something. She responded that it wasn't, and that she killed small animals all the time. usually cats, because she hated them, because that's absolutely a healthy and constructive way to deal with something you hate, right? Within the next minute, the staff person came back in the room. Ruby and I were still relatively floored by the incident. The staff was unaware of what had been said, and we didn't mention it. Fortunately, I left the hospital only 3 days later, and 2 of them were spent in a different room because an ant problem was discovered in my original room. I haven't seen Jade since, but I can't help but wonder if she's out there killing people or something. I'd like to pretend that she was just screwing with us in some sort of sick, demented way. At least she would just be a girl with a fucked up sense of humor rather than a psycho cat killer.
So, to give you a bit of backstory, a few years ago, I started to suffer with a lot of stomach problems. Fast forward 4 years, and it turns out I've got a stomach ulcer. Not ideal. Anyways, last summer, I had to spend a night in hospital, running some tests on it, and the main hospital isn't in my town, so my boyfriend offered to drive me up. We got there quite late, probably around 9 PM, and when I arrived, the nurse mentioned my boyfriend couldn't stay. I didn't like the idea of staying alone, mainly because I hate hospitals, so he offered to stay until they kicked him out. We fell asleep and got woken up about 6 AM by one of the nurses, explaining that they'd forgotten to ask my partner to leave, and even though she didn't mind, the head nurse would be on her way shortly to do her morning rounds, and I shouldn't have had a visitor in my room. So my boyfriend offered to go and sleep in the car for a few hours, and once they had finished the tests, they'd let me go. This is where it got weird. About 5 minutes into him leaving, this random guy walks into my room and sits down. He told me the nurses asked him to come in here. I know it sounds stupid, but I was in shock for a few minutes, and I sort of believed him. Then, I started probing him, and his answer was the same. He was asked to sit in here. By now, my fight or flight kicks in, and I ran into the bathroom with my phone. Don't ask why I didn't run into the corridor. Again, I clearly don't cope well in these situations. So, I get to the bathroom and call my boyfriend, who is crazy protective of me, and I tell him what happened. He immediately makes his way back from the car. At this point, from the bathroom I can hear the guy shouting, "What's this young girl's name? What age is she?" I don't know who he's shouting to, because no one is answering him. Thankfully, I can hear my boyfriend coming back into the room and asking the guy who he was. This must have startled him, because he ran off down the hall. When I came out of the bathroom, I noticed my boyfriend had a horrified look on his face. What I should have mentioned is that I wear contacts, but had taken them out before falling asleep. So between not having full sight, and in my panic, I'd missed that the man's hands, feet, and clothes had blood on them, because he'd left a trail of blood across the floor, across the wall, and onto the chair he was sat on. At this point, I went down the hall to the nurse's station. Still a little in shock, I explained what happened. Right away, someone came up to clean the mess, but again, they asked my boyfriend to leave, something he wasn't exactly happy about. The nurses were clearly trying to keep me calm, as they tried to make light of it, but I knew something wasn't right. And at this stage, I've realised the guy is actually keeping a close eye on my room, because no sooner had my boyfriend left, the man walked back in, closed the door, and began walking towards me, sitting on the bed. Thankfully, the nurse was present this time, and demanded the man leave. I don't think they'd taken me too seriously until now, but finally they noticed that having a bloodied man continuously trying to break into my room was shaking me, and they told me it was safer to have my boyfriend with me, as he must have been the guy's biggest deterrent. Rightly so, because for the rest of the morning, the guy kept walking past my room trying to peer through to see if my partner was still there. He eventually gave up, or was sent somewhere else. I finished my tests and was allowed home. The nurses tried to tell me that the guy had a head injury, which was the reason he was in the hospital, but they were obviously worried enough for my safety to let my boyfriend stay in the room. What worries me the most is that the guy was definitely watching my room, because every time my boyfriend left, he came in right away. It doesn't bear thinking about what would have happened if the nurses had kicked him out in the middle of the night. So, random guy in the hospital? I don't know what you wanted, but let's not meet.
So I worked as a police officer in the UK between the ages of 19 to 24. I am now 26, and I am a male. I left for personal reasons not connected to this story. One late shift, about 2 years ago from now, I was posted to the diary car. Essentially, I was to deal with scheduled appointments for low-level, non-urgent crimes. It was a bit of a bum posting, but we all had to take it in turns to free up the rest of the guys for the emergencies. The key thing with this posting is that it's for one officer only, so I was alone. I got to my 8 p.m. appointment, which was at a mental health hospital, a place I and most officers probably go to near enough every week. This is because patients run away regularly, and the hospital has to report it to the police as protocol. 9 times out of 10 they return of their own free will, perfectly safe and well. Tonight I was sent to debrief a patient who had returned. Pretty much I have to make sure that they are back and that they are safe and nothing bad happened to them while missing, that kind of thing. I like to add that I have a phobia of the mentally ill, particularly women. I hate going to this hospital and it never got any easier for me, but I had to do my job. This hospital is old and creeps the hell out of me, from the outside anyway. It has dark brown brickwork, huge windows, and what looks like a bell tower rising from the center. It's like an old church building. In other words, it looks like an asylum from a horror movie. I went inside and presented myself to the receptionist, who escorted me into the ward through 2 locked doors. It's very white inside, smells of bleach and alcohol like most hospitals, so like nothing outside. I get into the ward office and speak to the staff nurse. She gives me all the details I need, but in doing so, as per usual, I had been spotted by half the patients on the ward already. This office is locked, but it's in the center of the ward. I called it the Goldfish Bowl because every wall has a continuous window going all the way around, and it's like looking out of a fish bowl. The uniform I'm in is a massive draw for the patients, and they all surrounded the glass, tapping on it, shouting things at me. Reminds me of The Walking Dead a bit. I'm used to this though, it happens every time. I do need to speak to Mary though, the patient who returned, so I know I have to walk through all of them. I don't like it, but 2 members of staff came with me, and we walked through. No one touches me, just a few unkind words, but eventually we get to Mary's room. The door is open, and I look in before entering to see Mary sitting on the bed. I don't recognize her, and I'm not sure I've dealt with her before. She had dark blonde hair, fairly long. It was really greasy and hadn't seen a brush in a while. I know from the details I was given that she was 25 years old. She sat on the bed hunched over, head bowing down. She was wearing a t-shirt about 5 sizes too big for her, but nothing on the bottom. The t-shirt was huge though and covered everything. I said hello and explained why I was there, that I needed to ask her a few short questions, while reassuring her she was not in any kind of trouble. She said nothing. The staff members I was with had to leave as something was going on with another patient. I went to step into the room and Mary screamed at me,
"No, don't!"
I stayed outside the room as I could just speak to her from behind the threshold of the door without causing her any unnecessary distress. She then turned her head to look at me. I knew she was unwell, but she looked terrible. Her lips were chapped, and she had sores on her face that have obviously been picked at. I could now see she had self-harm scars down her arms too, and lots of them. Her eyes were so dark I could not make out her pupils. Really chilling eyes like a deep sadness, but also something very sinister. I'm uncomfortable, but I hid it and go to begin my questions. She interrupts me and says sharply,
"I know why you're here."
I assume she has been debriefed before and she knows the system by now, but then she said this,
"You're here to kill me, James. He sent you and now you've come."
She referred to me by my first name. This shocked me. It's common for an officer rank, surname, and shoulder number to be given out, but never their first name. Not even to the staff from the hospital, let alone patients. I don't know what to say. I want to ask her how she knows my name, but then I hesitate and think to myself, don't let on that it's your name. She continues before I have a chance to say anything.
"I'm not letting you take me, James. I will kill you because you will kill me."
She then screams very loudly. I'm frozen. I've dealt with a lot of shit in my job, but this was truly terrifying for me. She then rolls her eyes back so I can see only white. With her long, overgrown fingernails, she starts scratching violently at her arms and face. Blood is drawn instantly. I'm still not reacting. This is by far the freakiest thing I've had to witness in the line of duty. Luckily, the nurses heard and came over. They restrained her and suggested I may want to leave to help her calm down. I did so immediately. This interview was very much over. As I walked down the corridor, I could hear her screaming my name. Someone let me out and I walked back out to my vehicle, got in the driver's seat, and took a few minutes. I was shaking. I could still hear her screaming my name inside my head. She was a Shutter Island kind of scary, and I remember her vividly to this day. All of this went into my report, by the way. So how did she know my name? I'm really not sure. My name isn't James, it's less common than that, so I ruled out it being complete coincidence. The only rational thing I can think of is that being a regular visitor, I must have been with a colleague who had said my name on a previous occasion. She must have heard it and remembered it. It's the only conclusion I can come up with. Needless to say, I would check from time to time to see if she had run away again. She did a couple of times, but eventually went off the radar, perhaps transferred or released. I do not know. I still have nightmares about her coming to kill me.
I was in hospital for about 10 days, suffering from a kidney infection. My mother visited me, but the rest of the family were too busy, so I was pretty lonely and in pain. I used to keep in touch with my friends and family by mobile phone. Hospitals over the last 10 years allow the use of mobile phones. There was a young male student doctor who was chatty and friendly to all the patients. I can't remember his name, so I'm going to call him Edward. Whilst attending the ward, Edward used to chat to me. He was very intelligent and a nice and decent chap. He gave me a get well soon card to cheer me up. The other female patients teased Edward and said that he should ask me out. I made it very clear to Edward that I did not fancy him at all. I told him he was like a brother to me. Edward laughed at what the ladies had said. He assured me that he didn't fancy me either, and said that a patient-doctor relationship was unethical anyway. After 10 days, I felt better. The doctors discharged me. I said my goodbyes to the other patients, and to Edward, and wished him well in his studies and his career. I called a taxi to take me home. I'd put my mobile phone on silent. When I reached home, I checked my phone, and I'd had 8 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I was puzzled, but didn't think too much of it. I thought I'd ring the number the next day. I had a shower and went to bed. The next morning, I checked my phone. I realized I'd forgotten to put the ringer back on. I'd seen that I'd had another 10 missed calls. I called the number, and the man answered the phone. To my surprise, it was Edward. I was a bit annoyed, and I asked Edward how he got my number. He told me that I'd given it to him. I told him that I hadn't. He insisted so much that I had, that I even began to doubt myself. Anyway, Edward and I chatted on the phone. He would call me every few days. One day, I told Edward that I couldn't talk, as I was still not well, but needed to go food shopping before the shops closed. Edward offered to shop for me and bring the food to my place. I politely declined. After that, Edward started calling me every day. I often didn't take his calls. He texted me saying that he needed to talk, as his mother was ill. I answered his next call, and he told me that he had just said that because he wanted to talk to me. He said he knew I had an appointment in a few days' time, and that he would meet me there. He told me that he had a new mobile phone for me, and would put me on his family plan. I asked him how he knew that I had an appointment, and he told me he'd accessed my medical records. I did not attend the hospital appointment, as I didn't want to see Edward. I told Edward that I didn't want any more contact with him, and to leave me alone. Edward told me that he loved me, and wanted to marry me. Edward kept on calling and calling me. I did not take his calls, and in one day, I'd already missed 40 missed calls and 60 text messages from him. He even called me during the middle of the night. I was creeped out and beginning to get scared. One day, I had a call from an unknown number. It was Edward. Edward kept changing his number so that I'd pick up. I was really scared by now. I told the police, but they said there was nothing they could do, as he was not threatening me. Edward kept changing his number using a pay-and-go phone chip, so it was hard to prove that it was actually him calling me. I felt that Edward could get nasty and dangerous. I was particularly scared as my mum pointed out to me that he could find where I lived by checking my medical records. I asked a good male friend of mine to answer my phone call to Edward and pretend that he was my new boyfriend. Well, that didn't work. Edward didn't believe that I had a boyfriend. I was at my wit's end. I wasn't sleeping or eating, and I was terrified. I even had friends over to stay with me. I made sure that I was never alone. One morning, I woke up, and instead of fear, I was angry. How dare that stupid little coward bully me and totally take over and ruin my life? I telephoned Edward. I was very firm and assertive. I told him that if he ever contacted me again, I would report him to the dean of his university. I would send the dean all the text messages that he'd written to me. I told him that his career as a doctor would be over. And from that day, Edward never contacted me again. I just wish I'd thought of it sooner. But I was so relieved, as I could lead a normal life again.
A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just out of town. I was excited as it was my first job I'd been offered since my schooling. It was just casual work, but I was still ecstatic at the chance to work there as the money was great, and it was the place that I did my practicum at. Most of the time, I would do 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sometimes I would be given the 3 to 11 shifts. I didn't care for those much. I was used to working late for my previous job, but I had to drive a lot further to get home, and the late shifts are very slow usually. Another reason I didn't like them was because there was not very many people on staff, and I would get lonely. Usually 4 nurses, 1 admin, and the emergency doctor, that's it. Now, being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, so we've had the emergency helicopter drop every now and then. I've seen some pretty terrible things, like whole families die from accidents on the curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation as there was no vet nearby that was open. This one particular night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting talking with one of the nurses about a patient's chart, but mostly just wasting time until I can go home at 11 p.m. The hospital was quiet, and I'd only checked around 6 people in the emergency room at this point. I remember I was eating my yogurt, and I heard a strange noise coming from the main doors. I saw a man walking towards us. He looked mostly normal, but he had a long coat on, which was strange as it's the middle of summer, and even though it's dark out, it's still relatively warm. The nurse next to me sighed and got up to go to the bathroom, leaving me to tend to our new arrival. As he drew closer, the strange sound got louder and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him that I couldn't quite make out, but I assumed it was metal by the noise it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk and I could see his eyes were wide, his pupils big. His face was pale and it looked like he hadn't slept in a while. I'd seen this look many times and immediately associated it with someone who was high on something. He leaned on the desk and ran his fingers through his hair, pulling at it and grinding his teeth. I processed him as usual and noticed he was getting more and more irritable as time passed. Eventually, when I finished and pointed him toward the waiting area, he asked how long it would be. Knowing that the on-call doctor had gone on a quick break, I estimated a half hour. That's when his whole demeanor changed. The anger in his face was obvious as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room in between the emergency and the front desk area with doors. As he walked away, I got a glance of what he was dragging, and I came to a quick realization that it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the paging system, but I didn't want him to realize. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal the nurses that we had an issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes on average 20 minutes. Of course, as we were all small girls, we didn't want to go near him. He was tall and muscular. Even with us all combined, we probably wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited, but never got a response. I watched the man getting more agitated, and soon he started yelling and asking for help. I hid from him, not wanting him to come back to me. We devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass is reinforced and the doors are heavy, so it should hold him there until the police arrived. The plan went down without a hitch until the man realized what we'd done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room. He was alone, so we didn't have to worry about him hurting anyone. Then he started using his axe on the door and glass to the front desk area where we were all standing and watching. I've never been so terrified in my life, and what made it even worse was the fact that he was making some headway on the door. It was at this time that the emergency doctor walks in the front door of the hospital, sipping on a drink from the Max over the road. He saw us all huddled behind the desk and he quickly took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary information, he disappeared towards the back entrance of the emergency room. He unlocked the door of the waiting room and tackled the man to the floor when he wasn't looking, and then he proceeded to tie him up with the cable ties. He sat on his back until the cops arrived. I was so thankful for having the young, physically fit doctor with us that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think it would ever be enough. As this was the second incident that went down for me as I worked a late shift, I decided to never work late shifts again. I am now a Monday through Friday 9 to 5 worker, much safer that way. Hey guys, thank you all for watching my video, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Nightmare Army. I'm always looking for new soldiers in my Nightmare Nation. So as always guys, I want to give a big thank you to the Deathless Lord Cerberus for joining me on my Friday video. Thank you so much, man, and I have to say I really like your YouTube name. It kind of reminds me of God of War a little bit. Really awesome name, and I definitely think you guys will like him, so go check out his channel. And I do want to apologize because I feel very rude for not saying thank you in my last video for my channel going over 8,000 subscribers. Thank you guys so much. I'm really sorry I didn't say it in Tuesday's video. It's just Tuesday's video was just freaking insane. I mean, right after I was done editing that and I uploaded it, I was like that guy from Spaceballs, Dark Helmet, when he said, "Smokes if you got 'em." So that was like me. Like as soon as I was done editing it, I just went straight to bed. So I'm sorry about that, guys, but again, thank you guys so much for my channel being over 8,000 subscribers. You guys are awesome. And I do have a little bit of an announcement to make. I have been getting a lot of story submissions lately, a little bit more than usual, both fictional and true, and I want to do a Tuesday video on it instead of a collaboration Tuesday video on it or Wednesday. And I want to do that just because it'll spice things up a little bit, it'll be a little bit different. Granted, I will be doing probably a collaboration on Friday instead, if that's okay with you guys. But I really want to do it just because you guys have been really creative. You guys have been sending me a lot of stories, and I really appreciate that. And I want to give back to you guys and narrate it. So guys, as always, thank you all for watching, and just remember, the best ideas always come out of nightmares.